Welcome everyone to our episode 73 of our season 4. In today's episode, we are going to discuss and talk about learn how to think rationally instead of reacting. And to talk about this topic and to dive into the layers of our neural system and how we can start to improve the way we see and we assess the things that are externally being depicted to us, we use the article from Nen Siovici from 2018, Brain Activations Associated with Scientific Reasoning, a literature review from the Journal of Cognitive Processing. So, without further ado, let's start the discussion of how science plays a crucial role in most industrialized societies, meaning that being an informed citizen in today's world requires the ability to engage with science-related issues, such as, for example, climate change, epidemics, genetically modified foods, and nuclear energy. And of course, the controversial topics of the last season of our pandemic that we everyone lived throughout these 2 years. So this is the mentality and this is the kind of thinking that we are being required right now to really analyze what is real science and what is fake science. What are the things that are just being manipulated and how to distinguish among them. And to do that, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, in 2017, and the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, or the UNESCO, in 2010, agreed that the majority of people have to be more literature expansive in terms of the science topics. It is therefore no surprise that the leaders in both the European Union and USA agree that scientific literacy is extremely important and that improving rates of scientific literacy could be beneficial to society. Scientific literature individuals are defined as individuals who are able to correctly apply scientific knowledge and scientific reasoning skills to solve problems and make practical and informed decisions in their personal and civic and professional lives. So, to better understand the nature of scientific reasoning that could bring an interesting perspective to this global educational concern and eventually help political leaders and educators to make more informed decisions on how education can contribute to developing the scientific reasoning. So we need to understand that the primary points to address are the education systems and how are we really giving students and people in general the tools so that they can decide what is real and what is being just biased information or fake information that is being just manipulated, and understanding how our brains are going to assess that kind of information. It is generally accepted that the neuroscientific approach complements other existing educational approaches, which are cognitivism, constructivism, socio-constructivism, and that brain-informed theories of learning could be useful for developing new teaching and educational practices. Misconceptions are erroneous representations regarding natural phenomena that seem intuitively true to the learner but are discordant with scientific representations. Misconceptions are persistent, resistant to change, and need to be overcome in order for learning of several counterintuitive scientific concepts to occur. So these are the many of the manipulation that happens with the information, whether it is by channels of news, whether it is by social platforms, whether it is by people that are just self-labeled as influencers, and those so-called experts that they are just trying to say things, but they don't even understand the concepts that they are saying. So we have to be very careful who do we listen to, and what are the credentials and what are the background of the people that is just trying to give information, so that we can really rely on the kind of information that we need to understand, and much more if it's a topic related to our health. The mechanisms involved in overcoming the misconceptions have been examined by several studies from the standpoint of cognitive psychology. These studies all conclude that overcoming misconceptions is related to the implementation of inhibitory control. At the cognitive level, inhibitory control is a process that involves the ability to resist a habit, a spontaneous and tempting response, a strategy, or a conception that is inappropriate or erroneous in some context, such as the misconceptions in science. So if we just react to the information that we are being presented, if we don't even pay attention, we just listen and we let our emotions respond, it is obvious that even if you have a PhD, you can be in a state of fear just by listening and listening to the content that probably has been misconception in terms of the things that have to be conveyed for the topics of science. The process of this inhibitory control, or this regulation of the response that you have towards an information that you are receiving, allows you to pause your brain and assess the information and go and find in your own memory, in your past experiences, and if you have a background in science, in all of the concepts, to compare, to analyze, and to really and rationally think, what are they telling me that is true or not? For example, such as, this is a very, very simple concept. A virus is not an entity that is alive by itself. It needs a host to infect and to take hostage of the cellular machinery to replicate and to produce its own proteins. So without the host, any kind of virus will survive. So this is just a simple concept for people that have studied science. And if you just react to something that you are being presented, you are going to be fearful because you're not even analyzing, you are just reacting through your emotional system, through your limbic system. Instead, if you have those kind of concepts, you understand that a virus cannot survive just in the air for even for minutes in the air. It needs a host in order to survive. So all of these things we have to think through. We can't just react and start acting like in a very incoherent way. This is another example that happened just in the last 2 years. How many people throughout the world, because it didn't happen just in Mexico, it happened also in US, it happened also in Europe, it happened also in many countries that people went to the supermarkets during the pandemic and they bought a lot of toilet paper. What was the purpose of buying toilet paper in huge amounts of to protect from the virus, to avoid the infection from the virus? All of those things are just completely irrational because there is no purpose of buying that kind of toilet paper if you are going to be faced in a pandemic. If you were not going to be able to get out at all, probably, probably. And I am saying to analyze the things. But even with that, you have now in many of the countries the support of calling or asking through an app and buy the things. So there was no reason to do that. And many other things that have been happening and are still happening, like the face mask in restaurants, movie theaters, or even planes. People are being asked to use the face mask in a closed space in many parts of the world still. But if you are going to eat, and if everyone inside is not wearing the mask, what is the purpose of wearing the face mask? Just right in the line to enter to the plane, to the movie theater, or to the restaurant. If you are going to allow people to eat throughout the length of the flight, throughout the length of the movie, or if it is in a restaurant and everyone is already eating and they are not wearing the mask, what is the purpose of asking when you are going to enter into a space? And just think, in those places, there is an air system that is recirculating, even if they tell you that no, it is a recirculation of the air that everyone is breathing when they are eating or when they are traveling or when they are in the movies. So there is no rational thinking. Just think about that. The virus is not going to respect if you are eating or you are not eating. That's it. So all of those things are the unconscious actions that we can be left to do just because we are reacting through the fear and we are being primed by the news and by the toxic misconceptions. So this process of inhibitory control is related to error detection and suppression. It is part of a family of top-down mental processes known as executive functions. Those are the high-level cognitive processes often associated with the frontal lobes, which control lower-level processes in the service of goal-directed behavior. So there was a study on students aged 13 to 16 and observed a positive correlation between three variables. The student's inhibitory control ability measured using with the Wisconsin card sorting test, the scientific reasoning ability measured with Lawson's classroom test, and scientific concept acquisition measured using a test on air pressure concepts. The results of this study show that inhibitory control explained 29% of concept acquisition. Later studies that also use cognitive psychology approach reported that participants with several years of science education took more time to answer test items containing a misconception than they did with control items that did not. According to these studies, authors' longer response time could be explained by the recruitment of this inhibitory control mechanism, because you are having a pause, you are priming, you are enlightening, you are triggering, you are activating your mechanisms of higher control, and start looking inside of your memory to correlate, to compare, and to analyze your concepts that you already know, and then generate or produce an answer. Neuroimaging studies providing further evidence of an association between inhibitory control and scientific reasoning when students have to overcome misconceptions at the neural level. Inhibitory control refers to the capacity of a neural network to block the activation of another neural network, such as that in which a misconception is embedded and which would otherwise lead to an inappropriate behavioral response. On the basis of the previous neuroscientific studies that examines tasks requiring this inhibitory control, such as one analyzed from the researcher Stroop and go, no-go tasks, they identified three such brain areas in their priori hypothesis: the anterior cingulate cortex, the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Based on these results, in 2014, Mason and other researchers concluded that misconceptions and formal electricity knowledge likely still coexist in experts' neural networks, and that inhibitory control is necessary to avoid naive answers. So all of your mechanisms and your neural pathways are already activated whenever we are facing certain kind of information and questions. More if we start using this kind of inhibitory control and we pause and we have time to assess what we are being presented with. So if we think more through the information that we are receiving, even if we don't have a background in the kind of information that we are receiving, we can still use logical processes that become activated when you use this kind of inhibitory control. Moreover, Broad and other authors propose that the unexpected lack of relative activation of the cingulate cortex could be due to the fact that both experts and novice activated this cingulate cortex when evaluating misconceptual free falls in terms of the experiment. They suggested that novices could have activated this kind of cingulate cortex because their brain possibly detected the presence of a conflict between their initial conception of free fall and the scientific conception previously learned in school. So even from a concept that is so simple as something falling, as a free fall and gravity in those terms, is worthy of thinking, of reasoning. Why are things happening? There is always a correlation between the things that happen, and more if we are being presented with these kind of circumstances, such as the one that we lived in the pandemic. It is thus that all of these novices appear that they may have been at a more advanced stage of conceptual change than expected, although they had not yet reached the stage of being able to overcome their initial conception to provide scientific answers. because probably they didn't have even the background. Similarly to these studies presented by Mason in 2014, Broad, Foisy, and other authors had a general conclusion, which was that the cerebral activation pattern likely supports the hypothesis that experts' misconceptions about the mechanics are not eradicated during formal learning. Instead, their misconceptions remain encoded in their neural networks, where they coexist with the scientific knowledge. An inhibitory control is required to provide the correct answers. So what is this paragraph trying to tell us, or what is this information trying to tell us? That whenever we have a concept that we learn in previous year in the school, and we are being, if we had a misconception or if the concept was not explained correctly and properly in the school, we are going to ingrain that kind of information, store that information, and then when we are presented with another concept related to that information, we are going to compare, but we are not going to be able to overcome or to rationalize the kind of information that we are receiving, because we already have a misconception in the information that we have. That is why it's extremely important to understand the concepts from correct kind of learning experience and teaching experience, because if we already give poor quality of education and we train medical students or any kind of science students with information that is not accurate, we are going to lead them to not be able to recognize what is the reality of the things that they are witnessing, and they are not going to be able to overcome the kind of misconceptions or confusions with the very superficial science that many times is being taught in news. So in 2010, John Chiba, another author, using electroencephalograms that prove that two different types of artificial orthography training in young adults yielded different brain activation patterns. Training that consisted in directing participants' attention to the grapheme phoneme association yielded more left lateralized activation, which is associated in the neuroscientific literature with reading expertise. So this study or this kind of research is talking about how, if students are being taught first the grammar, and from the grammar they are going to understand the orthography of words, they are going to activate more the left side of the brain, which is more analytical and problem solving. In contrast, training that consisted in directing participants' attention to the whole world association yielded more right lateralized activation. So what does this mean? When we are learning how to apply concepts and how to understand words in a context related to the sentence and to the meaning of the sentence in the context, we are going to use more the right side of the brain, because we are associating more with an experience, with an emotion, with some things that we have lived. Instead, when we focus on the grammar And when we analyze the orthography and when we see all of those things and we are, for example, trying to edit a book and trying to pick up the mistakes of grammar or the mistakes of context or the mistake of the use of the words, we are going to use more the left side of the brain because it's more analytical. So that's how we understand also what type of brain are we using, or what region, not what type, what region of the brain are we using more. In the area of arithmetics, it was observed in 2005 by the Lasser using functional MRI that two different types of complex operation training in young adults yielded different brain activation patterns as well. Training that consisted of drills, for example, learning the association between the operands and the result, yielded more activation in the left angular gyrus, an area associated in scientific literature with expertise in arithmetic fact retrieval. In contrast, training that consisted in applying strategies yielded more activation in the precuneus. Thus, in the area of conceptual learning in science, future research could compare two different types of instruction to see if they result in different patterns of change at the neural level, and whether the brain activation pattern in novices nears or resembles the pattern observed in experts. That's how we have to switch when we are teaching anyone. We have to make them think about the context, the big picture of the things that we are trying to teach them, and also trying to give them an scenario so that they can imagine themselves living in the situation. And that's why the stories are much better to explain the kind of concepts. This is something that we can apply in our lives whenever we see the kind of information that is going to make us feel threatened or triggered. We have to first receive the information, then try to lay out the information in terms of the context that they are mentioning. For example, let's say that they are going to explain the kind of rules or guidelines where people have to use the face mask, and trying to understand the concept of using the face mask in certain environments. So we need to assess really what people are trying to telling us, and what is the reason, what is the rationale of what they are asking, and what are the proofs, because nowadays there's a lot of people where they can perform a lot of trials or a lot of tests to really see what is the kind of protection being given by using the face mask. But why don't we receive those kind of testing results? Why don't we receive the kind of information that we should receive in terms of testing something? If it were another time, or if it were another topic, for sure we would ask for the kind of test, the kind of results. So that's the way we have to start thinking more about the information that we are receiving. Always trying to pause, trying to use this inhibitory control, trying to use more the reason, and trying to awaken more the kind of pathways that are going to help us to first analyze more with the left side of the brain, and then contextualize more with the right side of the brain, trying to imagine the situations, trying to live with the or try to associate with the emotional also learning system. That's why whenever we learn concepts by memory, that is not um, really good for understanding what the real concept is, because learning by memory is just using some visual and part of the brain, and it's just storing the information that even a phone can do. What is the purpose of knowing the information if you already have everything in a phone? How to use the information, that's much better. How to rationalize the information, that's even much better. How to apply the concepts, that's the step beyond that we want. So another fundamental aspect of scientific literacy is causal reasoning, the mental process that consists in identifying causality, in other words, deciding whether and how one event cause brings about another event, which is the effect. Causal reasoning can occur by perceptual causality, the direct perception of causality from observing two events, or inferential causality, the inference of causality from the observation of events combined with real world knowledge. That is the kind of reasoning that we have to start applying, the inference, when we compare with world real knowledge. That's what we want. Causal perception is thus a more automatic process. The type of causal relationship is generally mechanical, meaning that it is based on the spatial or temporal contiguity of two events, such as two balls colliding. When we are just perceiving the concepts that we are being received through information to any kind of platform, and we use this kind of causal perception, that's when we can generate false concepts of the things. And that's when we are not comparing that kind of information with the real world information. And this causal perception, as the name says, is just being driven many times by your limbic system, by the events that you are being presented. And if I present certain kind of information, such as the data that I want you to see, and I don't present the whole picture, and you don't have time to relate it to the world events that are happening, then you are going to just react under the perception. For example, whenever we just listen to any kind of triggering kind of news, and we don't have the full picture, the concepts, and we don't even have time to process the information, the first response is going to be mechanical, it's going to be automatic, and it's going to be led by fear. And through fear, you are not thinking. You are shutting down your prefrontal cortex. You are not using your inhibitory control. You are not using your inference causality, because you are not even comparing with world events or past events. And you are just going to say, this is the reason why people are having headaches, let's say. For example, many people say that counting calories is going to allow you to lose weight. Okay, start counting calories about the things that you are eating. And what are you going to do? You are going to reduce the calories, and that is going to lead you to reduce your weight. So you are going to deprive your body from many kind of foods that you probably need and just reacting to the calories. That's the reasoning that you are going to apply to something that has a lot to do with the metabolism, with the activity that you do, with the sleep that you have, with the kind of emotions that you already have also. So the broad picture is joining everything together and understanding that each person has a different lifestyle, and the lifestyle is impacting their weight, not just the calories, not just the amount of things, but the quality of things, but the time of the day, but the kind of sleep, but the activity of exercise that they are doing, etc. So we don't need to just uh, use this causal perception, because the causal perception is what has led us to this point in time where we have a huge amount of chronic diseases and also mental diseases. Not that also can be generated because you don't even understand what is the real cause of the problem. And many times you just want to prescribe or take some pill to numb the pain and to uncover a lot of side effects. So causal inference is a more complex process in which the reasoner must evaluate the extent to which two events have a cause and an effect relationships. The type of causal relationships involved in causal inference is frequently correlation that is based on the observation of concomitant associations and the kind of thinking that is going to relate with the world events that we are being presented. So if we start assessing more the kind of information with having more attention to what we are listening, to having more reasoning experience in terms of associating more with the events that we have experienced, that we have lived, we are using more the kind of neural system that is going to help us to compare and to start enlightening other regions of the brain that are going to give us much more enhanced tools to understand what is happening in our brains and not just reacting, not just being prey of many of the false concepts that we can have if we don't analyze the kind of activity, the kind of information that we are being presented with. So what are the regions of the brain that are associated with this kind of reasoning, and how do they start enlightening when we give more time to associate these kind of systems with the brain experience? Let's see how the brain is using the kind of areas that are going to be enlightened with the reasoning experience. Let's just analyze this kind of concepts. So I'm going to present the information in terms of the kind of areas that are going to be experienced with the reasoning And we are going to observe also how can we start triggering, activating the kind of reasoning that we want in terms of using more our brains instead of just leading us to react to certain kind of information. This is one of the information systems that we have more, and this is how we are going to analyze the information that we can have whenever we are being presented with information that we don't have many times the background to understand. We can just use many logical systems to start adjusting more the kind of information that we are receiving. Let's analyze what is happening in terms of the reasoning experience in our brains and what kind of regions are we using more so that we can understand and what are the steps of analyzing the information that we are being presented with. So in this image that is from this author, Wang, in 2020, the deductive reasoning brain networks is showing us what kind of regions are we using more in terms of the triggering or the activation of our brains, and the results of the analysis for these cortical brain regions are showing that the left hemisphere is the one that is more used when we use this deductive reasoning, when we use this inhibition control, when we use this experience of downloading the information and trying to search more for the kind of information that sometimes we don't understand right away, and we need a pause to analyze the information. So these results of the analysis for the caudate are showing the inferior frontal gyrus, the inferior parietal lobule, the left hemisphere, the middle frontal gyrus, and the right hemisphere in terms of the superior parietal lobule. So all of these regions are being having electrical activity, and what we are seeing here is that it is the participation of all these regions that makes possible the spatial localization on the regions of the brain and the deductive argument. The left hemisphere dominance for deductive reasoning is clear, and we can recognize logical structures and generate a hypothesis regarding a collective conclusion. So that's what we are doing when we have a more deductive reasoning experience. We are trying to perceive the information. We are using the inference mechanism, and we are comparing that information with the information of our world experiences, as well as using this deductive reasoning with association of stages that will progressively transform the premises into a conclusion or a series of conclusions, which have stages that include the decoding of the linguistic information. So what we are listening, or many times what we are reading from somewhere. So the conversion of and correction of rules. That means when you are comparing the concepts that you already have in your memory. And then the transformation of the inferential results, which we use with the inferential perception, into conclusive outputs. And as we are seeing here in the image, we are also using the thalamus that is also connected to our memory experience, the insula that is connected to our emotions, and many of these regions that are from the frontal inferior or the superior gyrus or the medial gyrus in the left side of the brain, the dominance is clear because we have more analytical reasoning in this part of the brain, and because we are also using the kind of working memory that relates to concepts that we already store and that are going to be useful for. That's why at the beginning of the explanation of how can we use more the reasoning skills, I made it clear that the information that is important is going to be stored in the working memory. And I also have another episode where I speak about the different kind of regions, well, the different kind of classifications of memory and the different kind of memory systems that we have in order to make sense of the things that we need. Also, when we just use the perception, the causal perceptions that we were talking about, and we are starting mirroring the information and just using the mirror neurons to relate to the information, many times we are just also priming the emotional responses. And that's why we are not able to really process the information that we are receiving, and we are just reacting to the things. When we start lightening up these kind of regions from the all kind of medial, inferior, and superior gyrus systems in the left side, and also relating it with the insula and the thalamus, we are using a lot more of our brain systems, and we are making a concept more broad, more general, and we have a much better understanding of the things that we are being presented with. So that is the information that is the most important, so that you can start using your reason instead of reacting to the things that you are being presented with. That's why I wanted to analyze this kind of picture, this kind of image that is showing us how many regions are you really using of your brain, and how are you assembling a team or recruiting a team when you use your reasoning skills. When you don't use them, you are just being prime, being reactive, being used with the primitive brain. You are just responding with your emotional brain, and you are not contextualizing the things. You are not using the language reasoning skills. You are not using also the inference and comparing this with previous information and comparing this with your experience. That's why I wanted to point out this very clear, so that you could have another picture of how can we use our reasoning skills. Thank you very much for paying attention, for being here. If you like this episode, if you like the information that I am presenting, any kind of information that you want me to present, just write in the comments, give me a like, give me a reaction. And if you want more of this information, please subscribe to the podcast so that you can have much more information about science and wellness. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day, and we will listen to each other on our next episode. Bye.